David Turner's life was never supposed to be this way. A year ago, his company was thriving. Employees motivated, clients lined up, and dreams turning into reality. But today, in the blink of an eye, it's all gone. The scandal hit hard, a whisper campaign that destroyed his reputation and left his company in ruins. It started with a single leaked email that spread like wildfire across social media. Within hours, investors pulled out, clients canceled contracts, and the media's spotlight turned into a crushing force. David's phone buzzed with call after call from angry clients, skeptical partners, and even friends who seemed to suddenly disappear. His vision, which once seemed so bright, was now overshadowed by a storm of doubt and shame. As David sat in his office, the weight of failure crushed him. The battle he had fought for years was over, and he was left with nothing but the ashes of what had once been his dream. For the first time, he questioned everything, the choices he made, the people he trusted, and whether he should walk away from it all or fight to rebuild. David couldn't escape the noise in his mind. The calls had stopped coming, the emails had turned to silence, and the meetings were canceled one by one. He thought of everything he had built. His heart still ached when he remembered his first investor meeting, the look of pride in their eyes when they believed in him. But that was all behind him now. The trust he had earned, the dreams he had sold, were shattered in an instant. The betrayal was so deep that it seemed impossible to come back from it. David ran his hands through his hair in frustration. What hurt the most wasn't the financial loss, but the fact that he had trusted the wrong people. His business was his baby, and now it was crumbling in front of him. Maybe it's time to walk away, he thought, staring blankly at the empty chair across from him, a silent reminder of the people who had abandoned him. But as the moments dragged on, something shifted inside him. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. His fight wasn't over. In his darkest moment, David reached out to Sarah Whitaker, his oldest friend and a constant in his life. She was always the steady force when chaos surrounded him. David had called her earlier, but her voice on the other end of the line felt distant, as if even she was unsure how to help. When she arrived at the office, David could see the concern in her eyes. She didn't ask what had happened. She already knew. Instead, she just sat down across from him, her gaze unwavering. "You have two choices," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with both empathy and pragmatism. "You can give up or you can fight for what you've built, but you need to make a decision. You can't stay in limbo." David met her eyes, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She was right. He had to decide, but he didn't know if he had the strength to keep going. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't offer false assurances. She simply nodded. "I know, but you're not alone in this." The next morning, David sat alone in his office, the sound of the city's early hustle just outside the glass. The office felt colder today. Maybe it was the weight of his thoughts, or the emptiness of the space. He had spent the night going over every decision, every partnership. Linda's face haunted him, her once friendly smile now twisted with betrayal. She had been a partner, a friend, and yet she had turned her back on him when things got tough. David's fingers hovered over his keyboard, ready to type up an email to her, a final attempt at confronting her, a way to gain closure. But he paused. What was the point? The damage was done. As he sat there, a thought struck him. Was his failure a result of others, or was it his own? The more he thought about it, the clearer the answer became. His success, his failure, they were both on him. He was the one who had chosen to trust, to build, to risk it all. "I can't blame others forever," he thought. "I need to own this." He closed his laptop and stood up, the weight of the realization settling on his shoulders. David needed answers. The fog of uncertainty was overwhelming. His mind swirled with questions about what had gone wrong. But he couldn't stay in this limbo, stuck in fear and regret. It was time to face the people who had turned their backs on him. But first, he would need help. The call to Victoria Green, his mentor, was made without hesitation. Victoria had been a guiding force in his early days, a seasoned entrepreneur who had seen both the heights and depths of the business world. She was the one who had warned him about trusting the wrong people, about the sacrifices it took to succeed. As the phone rang, David prepared himself for the tough conversation ahead. He didn't want to admit that he had failed, but he knew he had no choice. "David," Victoria's voice came through the phone with its usual calm authority. "What's happened?" He didn't sugarcoat it. The scandal, the betrayal, the feeling of losing everything, he laid it all out. She was silent for a moment before speaking again. "David, you've been through worse. This isn't the end of your journey. You've learned a hard lesson, but that's where growth begins." Her words were a lifeline, but they felt distant. Still, they gave him something he hadn't had in days: hope. David thought things were stabilizing, but a new challenge arose when Greg Walker, a competitor, offered a partnership. David met with him, hoping to rebuild, but the meeting took a dark turn. Greg's words dripped with arrogance, as he subtly implied that David was already finished. David soon realized Greg wasn't just looking to negotiate. He had been behind the media smear. Greg had orchestrated David's downfall, and now he was trying to finish the job. As the realization hit, David's heart sank. Greg was more than a competitor. He was an enemy who would stop at nothing to destroy him. Shaken by the meeting, David's phone buzzed. It was Linda, his former business partner, asking to meet. As he drove to her apartment, the weight of their past betrayal bore down on him. He had trusted Linda, and now he was about to confront the person who had helped Greg destroy him. The emotional toll was palpable, but David knew he needed answers, and he wasn't going to let her escape this time. Linda's cold demeanor when she opened the door confirmed David's worst fears. The woman who had once been his partner was now a stranger. As they sat across from each other, David demanded the truth. Linda admitted to her betrayal, but her words were empty. She had been under pressure, she said, but David wasn't buying it. "You could have chosen differently," he said, his voice hard. But Linda didn't seem to care. She had made her choice, and now David had to live with the consequences. David left Linda's apartment, his mind reeling. She had been a part of his journey, and now she was a traitor. But as he stood outside, the anger started to turn into resolve. He couldn't keep running from this. The betrayal hurt, but it also made him stronger. He would rebuild, and this time he would be smarter. It wasn't just about regaining his company. It was about reclaiming his dignity. The next morning, David sat at his desk, his mind set on action. The media storm hadn't died down, and the investors were pulling away, but David wasn't backing down. He drafted a statement, but instead of playing the victim, he decided to take control of his narrative. The press could spin the story however they liked, but David would no longer let them define him. He hit send, knowing the battle was far from over, but finally feeling like he had a chance to win. David's decision to go public was a gamble. As he sat in his office, watching the hours tick by after sending out the statement, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his actions. He was putting everything on the line: his reputation, his company, and his future. But what he didn't expect was the immediate backlash. The media was quick to pick up his story, but instead of sympathy, they tore him apart. The public saw him as desperate, someone trying to save face after falling from grace. The stories grew more exaggerated with each passing hour, painting him as a man trying to cover up his mistakes with excuses. David's phone rang non-stop, but the calls weren't from journalists wanting clarification. Instead, they were from his investors, each one dropping out of the deal. The money that had once poured into his company was now drying up faster than he could manage. In the middle of this chaos, David received a shocking call. The voice on the other end was familiar but distant. It was Victoria Green, his mentor, and her words were like a punch to the gut. "David, I need you to listen to me. There's something you don't know." Victoria's voice, calm but filled with urgency, continued on the phone. "David, you've been played. Everything that's happened, the media blitz, the smear campaign. It wasn't just Greg. There's someone else involved, someone closer to you than you realize." David's heart raced. He couldn't understand. "What do you mean?" "I thought it was Greg. He's the one who's been pulling the strings." Victoria hesitated for a moment before speaking again, her voice softer now. David, it's not just Greg. There's someone within your own company who's been feeding him information. Someone you trust. Someone who has been working against you from the inside. David's stomach twisted as he tried to process her words. He had always suspected something, but to hear it confirmed felt like a betrayal on a scale he couldn't comprehend. Who? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It's Linda, Victoria said flatly. David felt the ground beneath him shift. Linda, his former business partner, the person who had once shared his vision and dreams. She had been the one to undermine him from the start. But why? And what had she gained from it? David ended the call with Victoria, his mind spinning with new information. He felt a wave of anger and confusion wash over him. How could Linda, the person who had stood by his side for so many years, betray him in this way? He sat in his office for hours, contemplating the next step. The idea of confronting Linda felt like a necessary evil, but David wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth. He needed answers, but he also knew that he had to prepare for the possibility that the betrayal was far deeper than he could ever imagine. It wasn't just business, it was personal. As David sat alone in his office, the city outside growing darker, he felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He had to find out why Linda had done this, and if she was truly behind Greg's manipulation, what did that mean for him and his future? David knew the moment of reckoning was coming, and he had to face it head on. The next morning, David drove to Linda's apartment. He hadn't spoken to her since the fallout, and his stomach churned at the thought of seeing her again. But there was no turning back now. He needed answers. When he arrived, Linda answered the door herself. Her appearance was the same, but there was a coldness in her eyes that David had never seen before. "What do you want, David?" she asked, her voice distant and emotionless. David stepped into the apartment, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "I want the truth," he said, his voice firm. Linda's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly masked it with indifference. "I don't have anything to say to you," she replied, her arms crossed defensively. "You've already made your choice." David's frustration reached its peak. "You've been feeding Greg information, haven't you? You've been working with him to destroy everything I built." Linda's eyes narrowed, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she smirked. "You're not as smart as you think, David. You never were. I did what I had to do." David stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Why, Linda? Why betray me?" The confrontation between David and Linda ended with no real resolution. Linda admitted her role in the betrayal but offered no apology, only a cold justification. As David walked out of her apartment, his mind raced. He had expected anger, but he hadn't anticipated the level of indifference she had shown. It was as though everything they had built together meant nothing to her. That's when it hit him. This wasn't just about business for Linda. This was personal. She had always resented David's success, the attention, the recognition. And in her mind, this was her way of taking control. As David made his way back to his car, he felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal and loss. But there was something else too, a fire igniting inside him. He wasn't going to let Linda or Greg destroy him. He would rise from this. He would rebuild, no matter the cost. The day David had been dreading arrived. He was called into a high-stakes meeting with Greg Walker at a neutral location, a luxurious conference room overlooking the city. David knew this was the pivotal moment in his journey. It was no longer about rebuilding his company. It was about survival. The game had changed, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Greg, seated at the far end of the table, looked as confident as ever, his polished demeanor almost mocking David's vulnerability. "I'm glad you could make it," Greg said smoothly, offering no hint of sincerity. David clenched his jaw, not giving him the satisfaction of an immediate response. Instead, he took his seat, locking eyes with Greg. "Let's get to the point," David said, his voice calm but firm. The tension in the room was thick, but David knew that he could not afford to back down now. "I know what you've been doing, Greg, and I won't let you destroy me or everything I've built." Greg chuckled, his smile cold. You're already destroyed, David. You just don't realize it yet. The words were sharp, cutting through the air like a dagger. But David didn't flinch. He had come too far to be intimidated. It was time for the final showdown. David could feel the weight of his words in the room, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to act. Greg's smug demeanor had to be shattered. He leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with determination. I'm not going to let you have my company, Greg. If you want to fight, then let's fight, but I won't be your pawn. Greg's smile faded as he leaned back, clearly not expecting the challenge. You're out of options, David. You've lost. It's just a matter of time before your company folds, and you'll be left with nothing. But David wasn't about to concede. He had spent years building this company from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let a corporate shark take it all away. I'll fight you every step of the way, Greg. You may have the money, the connections, but I have something you'll never have, integrity, and that's something I'll never sell. The words hung in the air, sharp and powerful. David's declaration was the turning point, the moment when the tides began to shift. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of control, and he knew that no matter what, he would never give up. Greg's arrogance faltered for a moment, but it quickly resurfaced as he attempted to regain control of the conversation. You're a fool, David. You'll never win this fight. I have all the power, all the influence. You're just a blip on the radar. But David didn't flinch. He had come to realize that this wasn't just about fighting for his company. It was about fighting for his own sense of self-worth. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared. Maybe you have the power, Greg, David said, his voice steady. But I have something that's worth more, a purpose, a vision that's bigger than just making money. You may have the industry on your side, but you'll never understand that. The room fell silent, the tension thickening. David had said everything he needed to say. The choice was no longer in Greg's hands. It was David's to make. It was time to take back what was rightfully his. The meeting ended with no resolution, but David knew that it wasn't over. As he left the conference room, he felt a surge of adrenaline. Greg had tried to break him, to manipulate him into submission, but David had stood his ground. He had finally stopped running from his problems, and had confronted them head-on. Walking through the lobby, David noticed his reflection in the glass doors. For the first time in a long while, he recognized the man staring back at him. He was no longer the defeated entrepreneur. He was someone with purpose, someone who had reclaimed his dignity. The battle wasn't over, but Dave had already won the first round. The rest would follow in time. David returned to his office that evening, his mind racing with the events of the day. But as he sat at his desk, a sense of calm settled over him. He had done what needed to be done. He had stood up to Greg, to Linda, to everyone who had tried to tear him down. He wasn't just fighting for his company anymore, he was fighting for the integrity of his vision. The phone rang, breaking his moment of peace. It was Sarah Whitaker, his loyal confidant. I heard what happened, David. You did the right thing, she said. David smiled faintly. It's not over yet, Sarah, but it's a start. He glanced out of his office window at the city below, the lights flickering in the distance. His journey wasn't finished, but for the first time in months, David felt hopeful. He was back on track, and no matter what came next, he was ready to face it. The days following the meeting with Greg were filled with uncertainty, but David's resolve never wavered. Slowly, the tides began to turn in his favor. The media, once ruthless in its coverage, started to take a different angle on his story. A few key journalists had picked up on his narrative of resilience, his fight against betrayal, and his determination to rebuild. As the coverage shifted, so did the public's perception. Investors who had once pulled out began to reconsider. David's inbox, which had once been filled with angry letters, now had messages of support and potential collaboration. But David knew that the true test wasn't about the money or the deals that were slowly returning. It was about the people who still believed in his vision. One morning as he walked into his office, his loyal confidant, Sarah Whitaker, handed him a signed contract with a major investor. You did it, she said, smiling. David looked at the contract, a sense of relief washing over him. But it wasn't the deal itself that mattered most. It was the recognition of his perseverance, the acknowledgement of the man who had fought through the storm to see the light. David sat back in his office chair, looking out at the city he had worked so hard to build a place in. The challenges, the betrayals, the endless hours of doubt, they all seemed distant now. As he reflected on the journey, he realized how much he had changed. It wasn't just about his business anymore. It was about what he had learned along the way, the value of trust, the importance of perseverance, and the power of staying true to his vision, even when it felt impossible. As the months passed, David rebuilt his company, but more importantly, he rebuilt himself. He had become the kind of leader he had always wanted to be, someone who inspired those around him, who fought not just for profit, but for something greater. And in the quiet moments, when he would sit in his office or walk through the halls of his company, he knew that this victory wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had believed in him when the world had turned its back. This is just the beginning, he thought. The real work starts now. The next step in David's journey was about the people who had stood by him. Sarah, Victoria, and the few loyal employees who had never wavered. He invited them all to a small celebration, not to boast about his success, but to thank them for their unwavering support. As they gathered in the company's new office space, David looked around at the faces of those who had been there from the beginning, the ones who believed in him when others had walked away. "We've come a long way," David said, standing at the head of the table. "And I couldn't have done it without each of you." There was a pause, then a round of applause. It wasn't about the money or the prestige. It was about the collective effort, the shared vision. And in that moment, David realized something that had eluded him before. True success wasn't measured by profit. It was measured by the impact you had on the lives of those around you. As the evening continued, the team laughed, shared stories, and talked about the future. For the first time in a long time, David felt complete. He had rebuilt his company, but he had also rebuilt his relationships. The journey had come full circle. David's company began to thrive once more. New deals were signed, fresh partnerships were formed, and the brand regained its strength. But for David, the true measure of success wasn't in the revenue or the growth. It was in the lessons he had learned. His approach to leadership had evolved. He was no longer the ambitious entrepreneur willing to sacrifice everything for success. Instead, he had become a more balanced, thoughtful leader, focused not just on results but on the well-being of his team and the long-term vision of his company. David knew that true success was about sustainability, about creating something that would last. As he looked back on the hard times, he understood that failure had taught him more than success ever could. It had shown him the importance of humility, of accepting help from others, and of trusting his instincts. And as his company grew, David felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons he had learned, both the hard and the easy ones. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, David felt ready to face whatever came next. As the months passed, David reflected on how far he had come. The story of his rise, fall, and rise again was now a part of company lore, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He had not only rebuilt his business, but he had built something even more valuable, a legacy. As he stood in his office, looking at the framed photo of the original team, he realized that the journey was never about the destination. It was about the people he had met along the way, the relationships he had forged, and the impact he had made. His company was a success, but his true triumph lay in the growth he had experienced as a person. He had learned that success was not a singular event, but a series of moments, each one adding to the story of who you were and what you stood for. As David looked out at the city skyline one last time, he smiled. This wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a beautiful beginning. David stood by the large glass window of his office, looking out over the city that had been both his battleground and his victory. The skyline stretched out before him, each building representing a piece of his journey, the highs, the lows, the moments of doubt, and the moments of triumph. He had fought for this, not just for success, but for something deeper. As he gazed out, the phone rang. He picked it up without hesitation. "David, it's Victoria," came the familiar voice of his mentor. "I saw the latest numbers. Your company's back on track." David smiled faintly, but it was a smile filled with deeper meaning. "Thanks, Victoria, but it's not just about the numbers, it's about the people, the vision, the lessons along the way." He paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the years on his shoulders, yet for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel burdensome. It felt earned. "I couldn't have done it without you," he added, his voice softer now. Victoria's voice on the other end was full of pride. "You've come a long way, David. You've built something that will last. But remember, it's not just about what you achieve, it's about what you leave behind." David looked out the window once more, his thoughts turning inward. The future was no longer uncertain. He had walked through the storm and emerged stronger. He had rebuilt not just his business, but his soul. After the call with Victoria, David turned away from the window and sat at his desk, his thoughts swirling. He looked down at the framed photograph of his team, the ones who had stood by him through the darkest days, the faces that had once been strangers and now were family. His phone buzzed again, this time from Sarah Whitaker. "We did it, David. It's all coming together," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Yeah," David replied, his voice steady but filled with a quiet pride. "We did it." He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The silence of his office now felt different. It wasn't oppressive anymore, it was peaceful. The weight of all the sacrifices, the late nights, the hard decisions, they had all led to this moment. David had found his peace, not through success, but through the realization that his greatest strength had been his resilience. It had been his ability to never give up, even when the world told him to walk away. And now, as he thought about the future, he knew that his journey was far from over. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel afraid of what was to come. David walked out of his office, his footsteps echoing in the now familiar halls of his company. The office was quieter than usual, a sense of accomplishment filling the air. As he made his way to the elevator, his thoughts drifted back to the very beginning. He had once stood at this same elevator, unsure if he could make it, unsure of the future. But now, as he walked through the halls, he knew that no matter what happened next, he was ready. The doors to the elevator opened, and he stepped inside. As the elevator descended, David took one last look at the building, a symbol of all the battles fought, the victories won, and the lessons learned. The doors closed, and the elevator began its descent. He was ready for whatever came next. David exited the building, the cool night air hitting him as he stepped onto the sidewalk. The city felt alive around him, but for the first time, it felt like he was no longer a part of the chaotic rush. He was in control of his own path now. David took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air, and looked up at the stars above. It was a quiet night, with the soft hum of the city in the background. He smiled to himself, knowing that the hardest part of the journey was behind him. There was still work to be done. He wasn't done building, but now he had the strength to enjoy the journey along the way. He took a step forward, ready to face the future, whatever it might hold. David's journey had come full circle, from the heights of success to the depths of failure, and finally, to this moment of quiet triumph. He had learned that success wasn't just about building an empire. It was about understanding the importance of relationships, integrity, and the strength to rise when life knocked you down. David knew that the road ahead would have its challenges, but he was no longer afraid. He had the courage to face them head-on. As he walked away from his building, the future stretched out before him, a new chapter ready to be written. David sat alone on a park bench, the city lights flickering behind him like distant stars. He held a notebook in his lap, its pages worn with years of notes, ideas, and abandoned dreams. He whispered, "I used to think success meant never stopping." The sound of laughter drifted across the park, a reminder of lives lived outside boardrooms. His phone buzzed again, but this time he ignored it. Instead, he wrote, "What you leave behind is not the buildings, not the numbers, but the people who carry your fire forward." He closed the notebook, feeling the weight of years turn into something lighter. For the first time, he wasn't planning for tomorrow. He was present, alive in this exact moment. Victoria joined him on the bench, her scarf pulled tight against the night air. She smiled knowingly. "So you finally stopped chasing?" David chuckled softly. "Stopped running, maybe. Chasing? That part of me never dies." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Good. Because vision without rest burns out. You've earned the right to breathe." He turned to her, his voice warm. "You taught me that leadership isn't about standing above, but standing beside. I only understood it now." Victoria's eyes shone with pride. "Then you're ready to teach it forward." David exhaled, the cool air filling his lungs. "I don't just want to build companies anymore, Victoria. I want to build people." The park fell silent for a moment, a shared stillness that felt like the beginning of something new. Later, David stood before his team in a small meeting room, no cameras, no stage, just people who had carried the weight with him. He said, "The numbers matter, yes, but numbers can fade. What matters is this: we stood when it was easier to fall." Faces lit with pride and emotion. Sarah spoke softly. "We never stood alone. You reminded us of that." David smiled, shaking his head. "No, you reminded me. I only gave words. You gave the fight." Laughter mixed with tears in the room. He continued, "The future isn't mine. It's ours. Whatever comes next, I know you'll carry it forward." His voice caught on the last word, but it was not weakness. It was gratitude finally spoken without restraint. That night, David returned home to an apartment that once felt empty, but now breathed with warmth. He poured a glass of water, not whiskey, and raised it to the skyline outside his window. "To failure, to fight, to finding myself again," he said aloud. He sat on the couch, no laptop, no reports, only silence wrapping him gently. On the wall hung the framed photograph of his team. He smiled, realizing it was not just decoration but a compass. He whispered, "I thought I was building an empire. What I built was a family." The quiet stretched long and tender, no longer oppressive. For the first time, David didn't plan. He simply existed, and it was enough. The next morning, the city stirred awake, trains rumbling, horns echoing. David walked down the street, sunlight breaking through tall buildings. I.e.g. His stride was calm, steady, no rush, no chase. A boy passed carrying a sketchbook, reminding him of himself years ago. David stopped, smiled, and said, "Keep drawing, kid. One day those lines will matter." The boy nodded shyly and ran off. David continued walking, the city alive around him. The future stretched wide, not as a burden, but as an open road. He whispered to himself, "The fight isn't over. It never is. But I'm not afraid anymore." The camera pulled back, framing David among the crowd, no longer lost, but found in the rhythm of life itself. The city swallowed him whole, but this time he was part of it, not against it.